Hi there, I'm Betsy Detiri. I'm a consultant psychotherapist and a highly specialized trauma recovery specialist. I've written a whole bunch of books that are some of them as bestsellers, and they're there existing to help people recover from trauma. I've written on all sorts of things from different traumatic experiences that could occur, but also what is trauma and how does it impact people, and how, more importantly, can people recover? Children, young people, and communities. How can people recover from trauma? I'm a specialist, and so I'm often called in by various different local authorities or various different charities to help when there has been a serious crime or a serious incident or a serious community crisis. And I get to support both the frontline professionals, the police, the paramedics, the other medics, alongside the education staff, alongside often the children and young people, and then the parents who are trying to support them as well. This is a very small, little, hopefully some top tips to help those of you who are adults supporting young people, particularly in the aftermath of a really difficult community trauma, such as knife crime, which has just happened in the city where the Trauma Recovery Centre was first started here in the UK, in Bath. So I just want to give you a little tour of what trauma is, how it impacts, and more importantly, what we can therefore do about it. Because what we don't want is for children and young people to feel that there's something wrong with them, for them to have trauma symptoms and then worry that maybe they're now ill, maybe there's something wrong with them, maybe they've got something. And in our current mental health pandemic, so many children and young people believe that there's something intrinsically wrong with them and they're seeking help for that. But what we know is when children, young people and adults have gone through a community crisis, a big conflict, a big terrifying experience, there will be impact. But what I know as a trauma recovery specialist is recovery is possible. And actually, what's happened does not have to impact their mental health for the rest of their life. But it depends how we go about doing this. And very often in these kind of situations, people will ask for help from anybody that looks like they might be able to offer help. And in the very few moments, maybe the first few weeks after a crisis, anybody who's able to offer a cup of tea is indeed such a wonderful and brilliant resource to all of us. But as time goes on, in order to make sure that trauma symptoms don't increase, but instead decrease, it's really important that specialists can try and help people and equip them with an understanding of trauma. Trauma is not actually currently covered on any qualifying course for a paediatrician, a GP, a social worker, or a therapist or a mental health practitioner. It's quite a complicated area. So I hope this gives you enough information to be able to navigate the children and young people in your world through this community crisis that I know has just happened in Bath and will happen again, I'm afraid. And so I hope it helps you wherever you are and whatever nation you're living in right now. So what is trauma? Trauma can be defined as any experience or repeated experience where the child feels terrified, powerless, and overwhelmed, and that challenges their capacity to cope. When somebody has experienced something that's terrifying, utterly terrifying, and anything to do with knife crime, anything where there's a panic, anything where there's any form of violation, anything where there's anything that grips us with terror, not fear. Fear could be a word that you could use for, oh goodness, I hope that, the post comes this morning, I'm waiting for something, I'm feeling a bit anxious. Actually, that's probably not anxiety, that's just normal anticipation, but people are muddled with words quite often, and we start using big words like anxiety when people are just a bit worried in a normal way. Terrified means that that's a really big gripping experience that impacts the body, it impacts breathing, it impacts the mind, it impacts body memories going forward as the body is gripped with this sense of terror, the worst form of fear. If, however, you feel terrified, but you feel empowered, so you have a sense of power, you can run and get help, you can run to a friend, you can get away from it and know that it's all over now, then actually that being empowered, it slightly reduces the impact of the terror. But what we recognize with children and young people is very often they are so reliant on adults, even though as teenagers they like to pretend they're not. They're reliant on adults, and therefore when they feel terrified, they usually also feel powerless. And that combination of terror and powerlessness is actually very life-altering. If at the same time they then begin to be overwhelmed, that tells us that they are unable to process the experiences they've had. And for many children and young people that have been on the scene of a big disaster, whether that's a war or a scene where there's been a break-in, or the scene where there has been knife crime, or when there's been a big experience that's been shared between children, young people and adults of terror and powerlessness, as everybody wants to help but no one knows how, that can lead to overwhelm. And what often happens is people want to talk about their experience, and then they find very often that the words are triggering. That as they begin to try and talk about it, actually the images that come into their mind can be very triggering and can re-escalate and cause the feelings of terror and powerlessness to overwhelm them further. And very often when people don't understand that, they can put children in groups to talk about what's happened. But what we know is when young people are in groups, unless that's very carefully handled, young people will end up telling stories that the other young people didn't know about. And now those young people that weren't as traumatized are now more traumatized, and trauma catches because it is stories and visual images and audio sounds that were full of terror and powerlessness. So we need to be aware that we don't want to re-traumatize or further traumatize children and young people that have just witnessed a terrifying experience. And instead, we need to help them carefully from their place of overwhelm when all these experiences are stuck on their insides and they don't know how to get them out. And for some of you, you'll be living or working alongside children and young people that are either stuck in what we would call hypoarousal, where they're stuck, they're lethargic, they're stuck in bed, they can't seem to move, or they're staring into space, or they're staring on their phones, or they're just very lethargic and stuck because they're in that freeze reaction where actually they don't want to think about what happened, they don't want to remember what happened, they don't want to be around other people who will remind them of what happened. So it's easier to be in denial or to dissociate where they're not thinking about it anymore. But what we know is when it gets stuck on the inside, it can become toxic, and it begins to be even more detrimental to their insides. And so we need to help people get it out, communicate and express what's happened, but in a way that doesn't re-traumatize or further traumatize those around them. And that's why it does need some specialist help, or at least some understanding of these nuances. You see, trauma is an experience of terror, powerlessness, and overwhelm. That's my definition, which is in all of my books. Levine describes it beautifully. She says, trauma happens when any experience stuns us like a bolt out of the blue. It overwhelms us, leaving us altered and disconnected from our bodies because of the shock. Any coping mechanisms we may have had are undermined, and we feel utterly helpless and hopeless. It's as if our legs are knocked out from under us. Many of the young people that you're around at the moment might feel like that. Some of you adults that were on the scene in the latest incident in our city in Bath might well be feeling like that, like your legs were knocked out from under you. Maybe you're struggling with breathing. Maybe you're struggling with nightmares. Maybe you're struggling with intrusive memories or thoughts or sudden panicky feelings. Or maybe your body is stuck in that feeling of being very heavy and very weighted and very exhausted, where you just don't have much hope for your future because you're so overwhelmed with so many experiences that are too big for you to process right now. Trauma is an event or a series of events such as abuse, maltreatment, neglect, or tragedy, that causes a profound experience of helplessness leading to terror. It can shatter our sense of safety, stability, trust, and innocence. And I'm so mindful that for many young people, when they've seen a major experience, particularly when that's connected with relationships, when they've seen friends suffer, when they've heard friends' stories of suffering that feels like there was violence and terror that seemed catastrophic, it can actually disrupt the young person's feeling of safety. And safety is a complicated word because emotional safety is more complex than physical safety. But at the moment, many of our young people are probably feeling that they're not physically safe, but they're also experiencing a lack of emotional safety. And those two factors are really important to recognize, and that those two factors need a treatment plan. They need a strategy for recovery, because otherwise we're constantly as a society managing symptoms. We don't put our recovery lens on to try and help people recover from them. And so I'm wondering whether you're thinking, how do I do anything? What do I do then? Well, for starters, one of the most helpful things for everybody when it comes to trauma is called psychoeducation. When people understand a little bit more of what normal is, what's a normal reaction to feeling terrified, overwhelmed, and powerless? What's a normal reaction to witnessing a crime scene? What's normal for my body? What's normal for my emotions? What's normal for my mind? What are normal things to happen when I'm thinking and trying to carry on with my life? What is a normal reaction to an adverse experience? Because when we don't know what normal is, we can begin to think we're sick. And what we don't want to have is a whole community of young people thinking that they're now ill because of what they've experienced. Because they don't need to become ill if we manage to steer them through a pathway of trauma recovery. So let's have a little think about how this lack of safety and stability and trust and innocence, how when that shatters, what happens to those different areas of us as humans, and what that can look like in order to normalize it so that there's less fear. How many of you know that when we think about little children, when they have to do a performance or a school play or an assembly, or maybe they're doing a sports event and everyone's watching them and cheering them on. How many of you know that it's entirely normal for them to have what they might describe as butterflies in their tummy, or they might feel sick? And sometimes I'm a mum of 4 as well, and they're 26, 24, 20, and 14. But I know what it's like to have a child saying, I can't do it. I can't do that thing because I feel sick. I'm gonna be sick, or my tummy hurts, or I feel wobbly or shaky. And when you don't know that that's normal, you might say, oh goodness, maybe we should take you home. Oh, you shouldn't be running. You definitely shouldn't be playing that match, or you shouldn't be on the stage. That sounds like you're sick. But when we understand that that's normal nerves, we're able, aren't we, as parents and carers, to be able to say, oh, it's okay. That's a really normal reaction. I have that too. When I'm going to do something big and I feel scared and nervous, I have butterflies in my tummy. I feel a bit sick. I feel like I'm not going to be able to speak. I feel like my throat gets a bit stuck. I feel like I could even be a bit dizzy. I feel a little bit scared and nervous, and my body can feel that too. When we're able to explain that to children, most of the time they're able to go on the stage because we're reassuring them with it being a normal reaction to a stressor. And some stressors are positive because those stressors grow our muscles. A traumatic experience is not positive. But we can facilitate children beginning to learn more about how we as humans react to stresses and trauma, so that we can educate them enough so they feel less powerless when another thing happens and threatens their sense of safety and stability. Because when adults don't know this, they also go to the doctor thinking they're sick. And it's really difficult to say, you're probably not mentally ill, you're probably reacting to a traumatic experience that no one's explained about and no one's explained what happens to. So I hope if I just spend these few minutes explaining what we call trauma symptoms, and all my books are about this, and I do keynote conference talks in schools and virtual schools and large conferences with thousands of people all over the country every single week to try and help the practitioners understand, because currently they're not taught. And so I'm trying to teach the people that people go to as if they know when they often don't know, because it is not taught on a mental health first aid course. It's not taught if you do a counselling course. It's not taught if you do a mentor course generally, unless you do a trauma recovery one. And whoever's teaching you needs to be a trauma recovery specialist with the relevant qualifications so that actually you know that you're safe. My books are on the course books now for most courses that work within trauma recovery. So trauma impacts us. And trauma impacts us, first of all, on a neurobiological level. You might think children and young people don't need to know that. Well, they love knowing that. And on a very simple, very simplistic way, we can see the brain as in three parts. That this part of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex. It's our thinking, rational brain. Where my sunglasses are, that's where it's our emotions. It's where our memory and where our relationships work, because there's different parts of the brain there in our limbic brain that are responsible for that. And then we have the back of our brain, which is called the brainstem, and that was the only part of our brain that was fully formed at birth. And so anything that a baby does is our automatic brain. It's our automatic way to breathe and to regulate our body. But it also has our threat reaction in it. This is critical, people. When we feel terrified, when we feel shocked, what happens is there is a shift on our brain level. And actually, immediately our brainstem takes over to try and keep pumping our heart, to try and keep us breathing, to keep us alive in the face of what seems like a life and death threat. And that has an automatic reaction that causes this part of our brain to go offline. We're not stupid and we're not mute. We just can't speak or think clearly when we feel terrified. That is a normal neurobiological reaction. And so we teach children and young people, and there's a video that I've made with the Trauma Recovery Centre called The Triune Brain, and we've got staff children that act it to explain it, and I can send you the link. Because I think all children and young people need to know that if you suddenly feel terrified, your brainstem goes, survive, survive, survive. And your prefrontal cortex goes offline and you can't think or be reasonable or rational. You do things that you don't know why you're doing them because you're doing them automatically. While your amygdala, which is on either side hemisphere of the brain, is starting to pump with fear, fear, alert, alert, danger, danger, which sends cortisol and adrenaline that causes people to have more strength than they think they're going to have, which is why people in the midst of a fight have more strength than if they try and do that at the gym. They have more strength and more power to run fast because it's a survival mechanism that's automatic and primitive and based in our neurobiology. When children realize that that's why they can't speak about it, because they're still stuck in their brainstem and their body's still alive and they're still walking around looking vaguely okay, but actually they can't think, they can't process, they can't speak. If nobody explains this to them, they can end up thinking there's something wrong with them. They can end up thinking that I can't speak, so I've lost my voice. All sorts of other things can happen. But what we know is that threat response, that threat reaction causes all sorts of other behaviors to spring up from fighting because they're ready for the attack. So children are more likely to either be ready to fight with the tiniest sound, the tiniest trigger, the tiniest sense in the environment of threat. They can be ready for a fight because they're not going to die. And they're ready. And they're hypervigilantly scanning the environment for movements or for facial reactions that might change. Or they're ready to run. They're ready to avoid anything that could be scary or dangerous. And they're in that space of checking the environment and being very, very anxious and nervy around any movements or sudden movements or facial expressions because they're ready to run. or they're in the freeze, and that's where they're more likely to be staring at a phone or staring into space or just not able to talk. And if you ask how they are, they're likely to shrug their shoulders and go, yeah, whatever, because they can't find words. And the problem is, neurobiologically, they can't find words very often because the Broca's area of the brain just loses the neural energy that's required for the brainstem to keep the person alive. So we talk about those as both hyper-aroused and hypo-aroused behaviors. And there are all sorts of things, and maybe this is all I can do in this little film. And I'll do a follow-on film for other of you who want to know more. These are normal trauma symptoms. If people don't get the help they need because they're actually just given people that have done very basic training and they just all chat to each other, and they can actually get more traumatized. If we don't handle carefully people's stories, the stories that someone else tells can traumatize the listener. If we're not careful with our words, they can bring to life things that have happened rather than reduce the level of terror and overwhelm. But trauma symptoms are normal in the short term. But with the right level of support and understanding, those trauma symptoms should decrease. And with something like a violent community knife experience, which leads to tragedy, that really is going to take at least a month, 2 months to healthily process. And really within 6 months, the community should be feeling very hopeful. But only if we go through this properly and not with what I would call plasters over what needs heart surgery. And so there's various different things that we can do to help. Recognize that hypervigilance, that scanning for the environment, means that you can notice things that you normally wouldn't notice. And people are very jumpy and like they're ants in their pants, and they can't sit still, and they're not very calm, and they're edgy. And that means that they don't feel safe. And so we need to help find them some emotional safety. Flashbacks happen as nightmares or in the middle of the day, where suddenly an image just comes from nowhere. And it feels like it comes from nowhere. Actually, it doesn't. It comes from a sensory trigger that causes that to invade in a way that makes the child, young person, or adult feel even more powerless. They didn't want to think about that. And suddenly, as they look at a car that's red going past, suddenly they have an image of blood, and they can't seem to get it out. And so they're acting as if they've just seen a pile of blood when they probably haven't. But their subconscious is muddling up some of the memories that haven't been processed. It can happen with the smallest thing. I tell a story that if you're drinking a banana milkshake when a trauma happens, you could be carrying on with your life pretending nothing's happened, and then suddenly just the smell of a banana milkshake could be enough to actually cause you to react in a way that it's like the trauma is happening. And if you don't understand trauma, then you could tell that child or young person off. So that's a ridiculously disproportionate reaction to a banana milkshake. What's your problem? When you understand that that smell of banana milkshake could be neurally linked to an experience of trauma, maybe where their foot was run over by a car while they were drinking banana milkshake, then we understand the impact of trauma on our subconscious, which is why trauma recovery has to be working with the subconscious. We can be emotionally reactive, just more jumpy and more having disproportionate reactions to minor stresses because our buckets are full on the inside. We can have that threat response where actually we're suddenly not able to think or be reasonable or rational or speak, and instead we're acting automatically, doing things that we don't feel we're in control of. Those are a little insight into the kind of normal reactions from a terrifying and powerless and overwhelming experience called hyperarousal. Well, there's hypoarousal. And that's often used with very big tragedies, with very big, terrifying experiences. A lot of children, young people, and adults will go into a state of numb, where they can't really feel. But they can't feel happy or joy, or they can't feel comfortable either. They just don't feel. They've had to numb their body, or they've had to numb their emotions. Dissociation is a complicated concept that most people don't understand. I've written a whole book on it, and I've just written a chapter for an international book called The Clinical Guide to the Dissociation and Complex Trauma. I've written the chapter on symptomology because it's more complicated than just glazing over or staring into space. That's just one very, very early aspect of it, which is entirely normal in the aftermath of a traumatic experience, but it becomes more complicated as time travels if the opportunity for processing hasn't been provided. It's normal to be slow and lethargic. It's normal to just be very glazed over and staring into space or a phone and being slow to respond. It's normal to actually be compliant because you're fearful of conflict and just do whatever anyone asks you to do. It's very normal to struggle to concentrate and focus. And those hypoarousal symptoms are often misunderstood. So I guess ultimately you might be thinking, but what can I do to help a child or a young person recover? And I have a little very easy thing to remember called the BDT 6 Cs. These 6 Cs are simple ways to help a child or a young person, or actually an adult, recover from that which overwhelmed them, both on their emotions and their senses. And it just means, number one, care. Show that you genuinely care. I'm sure you understand this, but caring is more of a sense, it's a vibe. If I said to you, I care for you, but I don't have the right tone of voice or body posture, you're not going to believe me. It's so much about our nervous system, the helpers, our nervous system being regulated so that we've got space and capacity to facilitate somebody feeling genuinely cared for. Secondly, it's about emotionally connecting, making that space to get on the page of somebody else that they feel emotionally connected to and understood. Co-regulation, I have other videos on, but that's an important factor both in toddlers. Otherwise, their brain doesn't develop properly when their architecture is being formed in their brain, but also it's a really important factor in all other processing of difficult experiences. And when there's not enough co-regulation, it does lead to all sorts of distress, which is often misunderstood. Calm is not the avoidance or the absence of conflict. Calm is, I'm strong enough to be able to be with you in this. And I know that I can be a support as I do this with you. And I will help you come to a place of not numb or denial, but a place of calm on your insides. So you feel more held and protected as you try and process those experiences. And that will allow me to try and help bring comfort to you. And comfort is very sensory based. So right now, for the children that are showing more hypoarousal zones of regulation, it could well be that they need you to help them, comfort them in that actually they need those blankets and those good smells which go right next to the amygdala. They need those thought through sensory. Don't just throw all senses at people and think that's helpful. That's really unhelpful. Each individual child needs to go on a journey of understanding which sensory comfort activity or material could be helpful for them. And then those can be utilized and used to bring the body that sense of safety when the body is in shock. The psychological shock means it's really hard for a child, young person, or an adult to think through, what do I need? What do I need? How do I feel better? It could be as simple as, on my desk, I come from Burundi and I have Burundian coffee. And the smell of coffee immediately makes me feel better. It just makes me feel, no matter what difficult situation I'm helping somebody with somewhere, the smell of coffee is entirely irrelevant to anything except I really love the smell and it makes me feel okay. And right now, if you're a parent, a carer, a teacher, or somebody, and you're trying to help a young person, find a smell that makes them feel better. If they've had experiences where they've been exposed to blood and difficult things like that, then give them really nice hand cream, really nice washing soap, and watch carefully that it doesn't turn into an addiction or something that's used too often, but something where they can smell their hands and they feel clean and fresh. Think through a blanket when it's a hot day. Maybe that's not appropriate, but something that they just feel safe within, because that bodily safety can help them feel emotionally safe. What could they watch on TV or on their screens that's positive and not negative? We're not utilizing dissociation, but we're recognizing that sometimes children and young people do need to watch something that actually just takes their mind off the current feeling of agitation and discomfort and turmoil on the insides. And that's okay, especially in the first few weeks after a big tragedy. But then watch it, so that slowly they can begin to emerge and make sure they're in some way expressing something, whether that's in a journal, whether that's in paper, whether that's in a song, whether that's through, using their guitar and singing a song about a tragedy, whether that's, making beautiful artwork in their bedroom or with another few friends, whatever it is, they need to externalize some of what is going on inside of them. Often they need to externalize it non-verbally, but in a way that is held by somebody near them who has the emotional capacity to help that be emotionally held, rather than it comes out and it feels so uncontained that actually that feels terrifying for them. So it's just worth recognizing those are the C's that are really helpful. A couple of other few things: journal writing, talking to somebody, but make sure that people aren't catching more details of stories that actually causes them to be further triggered and further traumatized. Different sensory things can help. It can help having a nice smelly candle. Just be careful. Just make sure they're with somebody else. It can help thinking through a safe place or watching a film where it feels safe. Music, making sure that the music isn't depressing music that's around them. There's different things like bilateral stimulation and breathing exercises that are really helpful. And I haven't got time for that right now, but there's lots of different methods. And some of us that are specialists in this area are very happy to help those of you if you need more help. There's lots of resources around. Just a tiny little insight into what trauma is, what the normal reaction of our body, our mind, our subconscious, and our emotions is to an experience that's terrifying, overwhelming, and where we feel so powerless. So that actually recovery from this is possible. The images in the mind, the nightmares at night, the sudden flashbacks, the feeling of anxiety, the breathing difficulties, the heaviness on the body, the feeling terrified and desperately wanting to be with others, but being terrified of being with others, all of those things are entirely normal. They can be processed and the child can go through to the other end to recovery. But what we don't want them to do is to utilize a trauma symptom as a way to cope, and then nobody understand that that's a trauma symptom that's good in the short term to keep them alive, but is not good in the long term. And that's where we need trauma recovery specialists to help. So I hope that's helped you today. I have a website, I have some training, I have a shed load of stuff. Take care and speak to you soon. Bye.